Welcome back to Mindset Monday, episode 13, Mindset on History. We are back for another enriching conversation with our very special guest, Dr. Manisha Sinha, on her journey to becoming a groundbreaking historian. Rohit and I were actually discussing earlier how the present is always a reflection of the past, and we can't necessarily just graduate from the past and ignore our history. History remains deeply relevant to our life, and today we are here to learn more about how to think like a historian. So, welcome, Dr. Sinha. We're so lucky to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Sachi, for having me. Thank you to you and Rohit.
It's great. And, just a little background about how accomplished she is. So, Dr. Manisha Sinha is the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a past president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She earned her Ph.D. from Columbia University and has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the Guggenheim Foundation. A leading historian of the long 19th century, her research interests lie in the transnational histories of slavery, abolition, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and feminism. Dr. Sinha is the award winning author of The Counterrevolution of Slavery and the Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, which was longlisted for the National Book Award. Her latest book, The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction 1860 to 1920, received the 2026 President's Book Prize from the Society of Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. She has taught and lectured internationally and has written for publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Review of Books. So trust me, you're going to learn a lot from her in this episode. So, to begin, I would really like to know a little bit about your background and your family. What influenced you to come to the US and study US history? Why is it important?
Thank you, Sachi, first of all, for that very generous introduction. And, I come from a family of historians. My father was in the army and later on became governor of two different states. He had another career after retiring from the army. And he wrote history in his spare time. And we just were a family of historians. It was the stuff of conversations over the dinner table. My sister and I are both historians. She teaches at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. But my father actually wrote more history books than both of us combined. And he did this by getting up like at 4 or 5 in the morning and writing before he went to work for the day, which was simply amazing. So we literally, history was, as I said, the stuff of dinner party conversations. My mother, who actually had a BA in those days in the 1940s. It was not very common for women to go to college, was a Gandhian and wore only khadi during the independence movement. So we were, like history was literally lived in our family background. And I decided to do US history because I sort of grew up in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, and I really got interested in the connections between decolonization in India and the civil rights movement in the US, and especially the ways in which Dr. King was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's notions of nonviolent resistance. And so I did American history when I did my bachelor's in Delhi University in India. And when I decided to do US history, I realized I'd have to come to the US because there was really no doctoral program in India that I could join. And in fact, I looked into programs. There's one in American Studies at Osmania University, but in Hyderabad, but they did more literature. And both my sisters had come to the US for to do their PhDs, and so I took the GREs. I applied. Only to the State University of Stony Brook because my sisters were there and I was too nervous. I was 21, had, just lived apart from my parents during my college years, hadn't really lived apart from them. So I applied there and I applied to Cornell. I said, oh, that's in New York too. And I got into both places and I went to Stony Brook because my sister was there in Long Island. And I thought, oh, it's close to New York City. I was there for a year and I realized that they specialize more in social history and I wanted to do political history. And then I transferred to Columbia for my PhD program.
Wonderful. So, just to reflect on on what you've said about sort of the past and present, your family is illustrious. I mean, when I met you, I found out that your father was, Shatrughan Kumar Sinha, and that he had, been sort of the number two officer in the army and was about to become, the chief of the army, but he would not go into the Golden Temple in 1983 under Indira Gandhi's orders, and so she passed him over. His officers basically rebelled, or at least they were furious. He said, let me resign. And then the person that Indira Gandhi eventually appointed to become the head of the army went into the Golden Temple, and that was disastrous. She was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguard. So we all live through history in a sense, but it seems like you really were part of a family that had made history, and an ethical family at that. Your point about decolonization, your point about sort of growing up after the civil rights movement, strikes me that we're again in another moment. I spent the morning watching the NAACP. Ben Crump was presenting the Nolan Wells autopsy findings, and that feels like another Emmett Till case in terms of Southern justice being applied in a negative way. But to follow up what Sachi was saying about your coming to Columbia, what was it like? It sounds like you trained under Dr. Eric Foner, who at that time was maybe the top Reconstruction historian, which may be a mantle that you've adopted since.
Well, you're right. My father, Srinivas Kumar Sinha, he actually was really instrumental in making sure that the Indian Army remained apolitical and under civilian control. And he advised Mrs. Gandhi against going to the Golden Temple. And in a way, that was the best thing that he got superseded for chief, because as you know, Mrs. Gandhi and the chief of army staff who superseded him were both assassinated.
Um,
So we feel, he dodged a bullet out there. He told her he would go in because he would not, defy her orders, but he says it was very difficult. It was really against what he thought the Indian Constitution said, to get the Indian army involved in domestic political issues, because that would lead to the politicization of the army. And that's what happens in all these third world countries, right? Including Pakistan, where the army is politicized, and so they launch coups, and this is really bad for a healthy democracy. And I think that's something we have to be wary of today, not to politicize our armed forces. Um, so in terms of like just studying with Eric Foner, your question, Rohit, I was in Stony Brook for a year, and our professors there were wonderful, and I picked up an MA, while I was there, so that was good. And I was with my sister, and thought I was crazy that I went to Stony Brook instead of Cornell, but it was the smart thing I did, because if I had gone to Cornell, I would have worked with a relatively conservative political historian out there who was teaching at that time. He is no longer alive. But I, at Stony Brook, was looking for a program which would suit my interests. And I had written a master's thesis on, why non-slaveholding whites and their relationship to slavery, and why non-slaveholding whites in the South would even think about fighting for a slave society. And the thesis was pretty substantial, and I was like, okay, I can look for a program. And I found Columbia because I really wanted to work with Eric Foner. He was like the leading 19th century US historian. Still, now he's retired, he's emeritus. And I really, identified him as the person to work with. I often tell people looking for PhD programs that you don't just apply, it's really important to choose your mentor, because in a way they can make or break you, and your interest, your research interest should be very similar to theirs. And I had seen him lead protests against apartheid in South Africa, and come on media and speak against the Reagan administration. I'm really dating myself here, Rohit, against the Reagan administration support for the apartheid regime in South Africa.
mhm.
And so he just seemed like, I loved his scholarship. And so I just applied to Columbia, and I didn't apply anywhere else. And by sheer luck, my GRE scores were really good from India. I actually had left math in 10th grade, but got tutored by a friend's boyfriend who was in IT, and I learned how to guess my way through the quantitative section. But I applied, and my Stony Brook professors were great. They didn't want to lose me, but they wrote me great letters. And when I applied to Columbia, Eric thought that I had applied to a number of other places, like most people do. He didn't realize I had only applied to Columbia. And he invited me over to attend his grad seminar. And they were trying to woo me. He had his grad students take me out for dinner to, tell me how great Columbia is. And he didn't realize that I had only applied to Columbia to work with him. And then I got lucky when I moved to Columbia. Barbara Fields, who's a very eminent Southern historian, moved from Michigan to Columbia the year I came. So I had two people really to work with. One person who really knew Southern history well, and then Eric, of course, who is just pretty much a master of his craft in knowing American history. And they were great mentors to me. They gave me the right amount of feedback, the right amount of leeway and independence to write my own work, and the right amount of inspiration. I would just sit in the undergrad lectures because I had never had those professors. They were just teaching me grad seminars. And that was a wonderful experience because I just got to know more about them. And so, yeah, I lucked out. And my experience at Columbia was fantastic. I loved New York City. I fell in love with New York City and, just really enjoyed my years there. Besides the graduate program, I also taught in the Western Civ core curriculum for Columbia College. In fact, recently I just did a talk for all the professors and instructors for Western Civ at Columbia because they somehow remembered that I had taught it like, I don't know, 40 years ago. So, in all, it was a good experience, and I got a lot of time to really write the dissertation, which became eventually my first book.
That's absolutely amazing. And it's so inspiring to see not only is history deeply familial for you, but you were curious and you were passionate and you really took the initiative to look for mentors and to be inspired in the education and the learning. And so that kind of brings me to my question of, for people that don't think about history as often as you do, or maybe don't think they have time for it on top of other things, why is it important to actually study history? And how might it look different from the work of maybe a scientist discovering a new theory, and
Yeah.
maybe more as a skilled archaeologist, kind of illuminating what others have not seen yet from the same story or the same information?
Yeah, Sachi, I think that's such a great question because, I'm not one of those people who say history repeats itself or history rhymes, as it's become popular to say. But I really think our present is informed by our past. And many of the issues that we are facing today in the United States, including the resurgence of a kind of a very overtly racist, reactionary, authoritarian tradition, will be surprising to most Americans and to people across the globe if they're not familiar with American history and contestations in the past over, issues like, we had a bloody civil war in which more Americans died than the two world wars, the Vietnam War and the Korean War combined. So if you don't understand that huge conflagration over slavery, or if you don't understand this contestation that has taken place throughout American history between reactionary and democratic forces, you won't understand our present. So I think to be a good American citizen, you need to know history. History matters. And increasingly, I find myself being called upon to write op-eds, to do podcasts like yours, and people looking at my work and saying, hey, this sounds familiar. And now I can understand a little bit more about where we are today. So I really think history matters, even though if you're not a professional historian like me, I'm really against the way history was undermined, really, in the United States. You'd have your football coach teaching high school history, usually, not somebody who's trained to study history. But if you look at the attacks on the teaching and study of American history by the current regime in the United States, attacks even on the Smithsonian public representations of history. you realize that these people know history matters and that it's important, because they don't want a more complex, a more nuanced version of our past
Mhm.
being taught. So I think history, historians, like any other human beings, are influenced by the times we write in. And I think there was a great book that my cousin, who went to Cambridge before me, um, gave me when he realized that I was coming to the US to study history. And it's called What is History by E.H. Carr. It's a very, very old book by a British historian. And he says, as historians, we're human beings, and obviously we are influenced by the times that we write in. But we are also social scientists, and we need to make sure, like the archaeologists you referenced in your question, that we have enough evidence to support our argument. I always tell my students, I'm not here to indoctrinate you. You can have your own opinions and your own interpretations, but you can't invent your facts. You know that you need to back up your ideas, whether it's through secondary literature or actually reading primary sources like, the declarations of secession of southern states saying, why are we seceding? And they all say slavery, slavery, slavery all over the place. So, if you discount that, you will have to discount that primary evidence. And after Thomas Kuhn, we know, the structures of scientific revolutions, that even scientists are influenced by the times that they write in. I actually did an article that was published by the Peabody Museum on the rise of scientific racism, the pseudoscience of race, which was like really popular in the early 20th century, right? Louis Agassiz and other eminent Harvard scientists who propounded multiple origins of man, etc. And they were actually opposed by many African American intellectuals and later on by anthropologists like Franz Boas, etc. But, in the 19th century itself, that debate was going on. So we know even science itself is not as apolitical or as objective. And that's why scientific method now includes so many safeguards, right? You have to be able to repeat your experiments. You have to be able to, you can't just like make up stuff. And all the stuff on the pseudoscience of race has been completely disregarded and demolished by current day scientists. So clearly, we are all creatures of the times that we live in, and we are influenced by the events in our society around us. But we try our best to, in good faith, present arguments and interpretations that are backed by research. And we historians who are professional historians and not like just independent writers or people who just do history as a kind of a fad or a thing, we are trained in the historical method. And you decide how you can not lift a singular fact out of its context and then say, aha, this proves my theory. One of my favorite examples to my students is those who say, oh, Africans participated in the African slave trade, and therefore everyone was guilty, and there's no such thing as, you know, um, that this shouldn't be seen as an enormous crime against humanity committed particularly by enslavers. And I'm like, yes, of course they participated, but who's setting the terms of that trade? Who's controlling the trade? Who's benefiting from it? And is Africa winning or losing? So the fact that a few merchants or kings in Africa made some private gains, does that mean that Africans were equally responsible? So that was my favorite example because when I started teaching, there were a bunch of these not professionally trained historians, but people outside the academia who would come up with these quote facts. Oh, look, we found this. So it's really important that you be trained in historical method, that you learn how to situate facts in a broader set of facts and do the research in that time period to be able to understand what you're saying. Um, and so, yeah, I think history, it is at the cusp of the humanities and the social sciences. So we are not a natural science, we are a social science. We are particular about evidence and theory, but we are also humanities. So narrative is important. I want people to read my books. I don't want it to be in such an esoteric language that, they just look at it and throw up their hands and rather read something written by an independent scholar who actually may not have done all the research in the field.
So beautifully said. I love how you connected history to science, because I think what you're almost getting at least what I'm thinking about, is intellectual history, the history of ideas. In the medical field, they say, medical knowledge turns over every, like 50% of it turns over every 5 years. So what you learn in medical school may not be accurate at all in a few years. You don't know which 50% will remain, which 50% will turn over. So we have to be humble in a sense, in the scientific realm. And your Thomas Kuhn reference was right on. That's really what I was hoping you might discuss, because paradigms in science, they're paradigms. And a scientist may say, wait, I have evidence that overturns a previous paradigm. And there's often resistance to that. But I think, as you speak, I think I realize maybe history, or at least, history may look more like currents and waves, or at least with ideas, certain currents, or ideas like eugenics may come up at a certain point. Confederate statues may be erected not in the 1860s during the Civil War, but in the 1910s, 1920s, when white supremacy rose again. But it rose again perhaps because Black free men were becoming successful. So the Tulsa race massacre, in 1920 or thereabouts, was basically a backlash. So you have these periods, I suppose, where people become successful, and then there's a backlash against it. And the backlash is often perhaps because of ideas like, white supremacy. And the cornerstone of the Confederacy, according to Alexander Stevens, was, that the white man is superior to the Black man. And that's a law of nature. Ibram X. Kendi, when he wrote Stand from the Beginning, he changed my thinking with his paradigm of, well, slavery existed because people needed, Americans needed people to till the land, or wanted people to till the land and, kind of do the farming. So they brought them in. Then they codified it through laws that this was legal, and abetting, runaway slaves was illegal. So now you've codified it to kind of crystallize these, unfair structures. And then he said racist ideas came about to justify why they were doing what they were doing. Like, well, they're happier. People are happier in slavery. What would they be doing in their home continent anyway? We are Christianizing them. So all of these ideas came forth to justify kind of really what was horrible behavior and just absolute cruelty. And I think of Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, and how that decision, which was meant to be a freeing decision, led to an incredible backlash, the civil rights movement. And again, this Nolan Wells case brings you back to Emmett Till, because you have structures in place which protected certain people and made others more vulnerable. But it seems like in this day and age, we have nativism arising perhaps because of the success of immigrants, and you have, again, white supremacy rising because of perhaps the presidency of Barack Obama, vice presidency of Kamala Harris, and her almost attaining the presidency. But there's really quite a backlash. So I wanted to know, you're curating the ongoing exhibit on Reconstruction at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library in Springfield, and your exhibit is titled, as your book is, The Second American Revolution. I do plan to see it before it closes in January 2027, but wanted to know what you learned along the way that you share with the public, and especially kind of the idea you have about Reconstruction, which seems to change the paradigm that we at this point have, that I think we thought it was 1868 to 1877 with the, with that bargain, the corrupt bargain, Hayes and Tilden, but you're extending it to 1920. So, that's a really interesting paradigm and idea. And you, I think, point out, not to steal your thunder, but I think you're pointing out that the forces of domination kind of went towards, became sort of the robber barons domestically, and perhaps colonialism abroad. If I sort of have this correct, but I mean, I feel like you really created a paradigm shift in how we think about Reconstruction. So whenever you can talk about that.
Thanks, Rohit, for that question. I actually admire you doctors, because I know they tend to take exams even after they're practicing to keep up with their field. And I was like, oh my God, I'm glad I don't have to do that. But yeah, we end up researching our books, so we always have to keep in, we have to keep the current research in mind. And you're right, I was asked for the first time. I've taken part in exhibitions before as a contributor, but I was actually asked to curate this exhibition for the 250th of the founding of the American Republic at the Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And I called the exhibition the Second American Revolution, and they wanted me to base it on my book. They said, we want the whole exhibition, they wanted to connect the time period of Lincoln and the Civil War with the founding. And they wanted me to base it in my book, and it was a great opportunity for me. Because I'm like, sure, you want to do a book? Sure, I'll do it. But it was really a learning experience, and I think it was really important for me to see how I could translate the ideas of my book to a broader public, whether it was through the display of objects, and they got some of my favorite objects there, including the pen that Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation from the Mass Historical Society, which was accompanied by Boston State Troopers and insured for millions of dollars, and is under a bulletproof, glass encasing. And so for me, it was a learning experience just to see how objects could tell the story. But I did all the writing for it, the different sections, the topics, what we can use, and made sure that women were included, because an important part of my book was to look at this period also as women's history and look at all the abolitionists, feminists, and suffragists who became important during this period. But, I tend not to view the history of the United States as simply a history of racist reaction, which covers all white Americans under the broom of the brush of racism. I think that's a very simplistic idea, and it's just as simplistic as the one that it seeks to replace, which is this mythic notion of American history and, American exceptionalism and the progress of freedom. In fact, what I call the Second American Revolution, and as I book The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, shows that the history of American republicanism has not progressed in a sort of linear line with just people who were disfranchised just being included into something that remains unchanged. In fact, there's huge contestation over who should be included, who should be a citizen. As you mentioned, there's a backlash against not just our interracial modern democracy, but also against immigrants, right? And I think part of it was Kamala Harris's run for the presidency, where we were like, and the reason why I'm here is because of the 1965 Immigration Act that liberalized immigration from the rest of the world. And that was a direct result of the Black struggle for freedom and the civil rights movement. And now there's they want to get rid of that because they don't want people from what Trump calls S-hole countries to come. He wants immigrants from Norway and Denmark only. And that is the Immigration Act of 1924 that actually even saw Southern and Eastern Europeans as, quote, lesser whites and discriminated against Catholics and Jews. So, the retrenchment that they're talking about is pretty old. And you have people like J.D. Vance, who's married to an Indian American, like propagate these ideas. So the hypocrisy and the idiocy is quite apparent. But I think it's important to look at this period because, as you mentioned in your question, there is a moment during Reconstruction, the high tide of Reconstruction in the 1860s and 1870s, early 1870s, when we get these major constitutional amendments and the first federal civil rights laws, the first hate crime laws against racist domestic terror groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and the foundation of the Department of Justice, which is, of course, now, I don't know what's happening there, but was founded as an independent federal institution to really ensure equal justice for everyone and make sure that no one, including if it includes the president himself, is above the law. And so all those very landmark things that happened during Reconstruction, and then it's all overturned. And what my book does, which previous books on Reconstruction don't do, including that of my mentor, Eric Foner, and that's why I told him, I said, my book is like a sequel to your book, I told him, because I look at the period after 1877. I look at how Reconstruction is undone in the South, because these
Mm,
vast changes are not just like overnight, there's a compromise and everything is gone. No, it takes a long time for it to be undone. There's also, like the Confederate statues come up during this time, between like 1890 to 1920, because they're marking the triumph of the South, right? They've lost the war, but they won the peace with Jim Crow and disfranchisement. Southern state constitutions are being rewritten at this time to undo the gains of Reconstruction and systematically exclude and disfranchise Black people. Supreme Court decisions that are extremely reactionary
mm,
completely eviscerate all the progress that had been done under the constitutional amendments and the civil rights laws during Reconstruction. That sounds familiar today, right? Rights given and taken. And this is linked, as you said very perceptively in your question, to the takeoff of industrial capitalism in the North, where many of these robber barons of the Gilded Age are very sympathetic to Southern elites who are complaining about Black labor in the plantations, because they're complaining about immigrant workers coming from Southern and Eastern Europe to their factories. And this is a period of tremendous labor strife, and all those federal troops that were protecting Black rights in the South are being taken away to the North to fire on striking workers,
mm.
and to conquer the West. This is when the last of the indigenous nations in the Great Plains in the West are completely destroyed. Think of the
That's
Wounded Knee
true.
Massacre of 1890,
Mm.
and their lands are
Really big
taken and
one.
they're confined to reservations, their sovereignty taken. And that becomes a stepping stone to the United States acquiring overseas territories, right? Becoming a colonial power. And this is very sort of disputed in the United States at that time, because the American conception is that we are a republic, not an empire, that we fought against British imperialism, that we fought against European imperialists. But now, because of the Spanish-American-Cuban
Mhm.
War of
Revolution.
1898, they acquire, they colonize the Philippines, they annex
Right,
Hawaii,
right.
they annex Puerto Rico, they get Guam, and all these places that are still in a colonial relationship, really, to the United States. So the United States becomes an imperial power under William McKinley. You have tariffs, you have imperialism, and that's why he's Trump's new favorite president, right? William McKinley. Had anyone ever heard of him before? No.
Yeah.
He's not a particularly significant president, but his presidency did signify the conversion of the Republican Party from the party of Lincoln, anti-slavery, black rights, and Reconstruction to the party of big business, and to the party of imperialism, right? With all these new colonies that they're acquiring abroad. So I wanted to link all these events with the fall of Reconstruction in the South. You have the fall of interracial democracy. You have the colonial conquest of Indian nations. You have a period of rapacious capitalism where the robber barons are in charge, and the Republican Party pretty much
Mhm.
espouses their interests at this time. The Democratic Party is the party of the Dixiecrats or racist Southern Democrats. So if you're a progressive person in late 19th century America, it's very difficult to find a political home in the two-party system. And so I wanted to see how all this came together. And the book really ends, though, with the 19th Amendment, which I call the
Mhm.
last Reconstruction Amendment,
Ah,
because it's the endpoint to the suffrage movement that begins during the Civil War and
mhm. Seneca
Reconstruction, and
Falls.
with women getting the right to vote, right? And it's totally modeled after the 15th Amendment that gave Black men the right to vote. But these issues are still with us, Rohit, right? Because we are still debating the 14th Amendment. We just got a decision from the Supreme Court that finally vindicated national citizenship by birthright. But the 14th Amendment's national citizenship section says by birthright or naturalization. People forget the naturalization part. That's a really important part of the 14th Amendment, that says you can be naturalized as a US citizen regardless of race or color or where you come from. And so it's important for us to remember that part too today.
Absolutely. I mean, you just mentioned, that was my next question. Your work was recently cited in the Supreme Court birthright citizenship decision in Justice Jackson's correspondence. So, what was this experience like for you, having your book being cited here?
Yeah, it was kind of crazy because I had taken part in amicus briefs before as a historian in some of the cases that had come up before the Supreme Court. People, some lawyers or some other historians who had asked me to sign on, and I would sign on to these amicus briefs. And before my book was published, Jill Lepore and David Blight had put together an amicus brief in another case, and they said, "Can we use your book?" Even though I'm like, "Yeah, sure, go ahead, whatever supports your position." So, I was familiar. I mean, I didn't think I'd ever be co-signing amicus briefs before the Supreme Court, but that was my extent of participation. I was in Germany. I was doing an event in Heidelberg. And after the event was over, I came back and had like a million messages from the US and my in DMs and my social. Did you know Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson cited your book? And I was like, oh wow, that was. I mean, really, she is to me shaping up as the great dissenter of our times, the way John Marshall Harlan was in the late 19th century against Plessy versus Ferguson and some other decisions by the Supreme Court that undid Reconstruction. And so I'm a great admirer of hers. And what was interesting about her concurrence is how she and clearly the clerks, or I should use American English, clerks who work with her have read history and cited so much history in her concurrence. And sometimes when you write history, you think, what am I doing in terms of actually contributing to the discussion on democracy in our times? And to me, that was like an amazing moment. I had before addressed members of Congress. This is before the 2024 elections in September 2024. They choose one or two history books as a common congressional read. And I had actually done that. And so for me, that was like, oh my God, I actually get to speak to people in power. But I didn't realize that the Republicans thought that they should take the wrong lesson from my book and imitate the people who were, challenging Reconstruction. But it was quite something. And what was interesting about the way she cited my book was that she cited Eric Foner, who was my mentor, and then she cited my book, and then she cited a book by my first student at UMass. His book again on colonization and African American rights against when it died, which was his dissertation and became his first book. Usman Power Green, she cited his book. So it was like a complete circle, of historical scholarship that she cited both my mentor and my very first doctoral student, who's now a professor at Clark University in Worcester, right here in Massachusetts. So I met him recently and I told him, this is a real full circle moment for me.
Beautiful. So you describe mentorship beautifully, right? I mean, so Eric Foner mentored you, you mentored, your student who's now a professor at Clark. In terms of being a scholar in this field, what kinds of challenges have you faced? As a perhaps maybe even demographically as an immigrant from India, as a woman. I'm not sure if those have factored in, but what has it been like to be a scholar of history in the U.S. at this time? What kind of barriers have there been?
Yeah, so that's a really important question because, when I went onto the job market, which was in the early 1990s, people would ask me sometimes in job interviews, what made you, an Indian American, choose to do, US history? And, the interesting part though for me was that it was enough of a meritocracy that just based on my dissertation and publications and fellowships, that people were willing to offer me jobs. I had multiple offers, which is very unusual in history. We don't get that many offers. So it was a relatively open time for me. And I chose UMass mainly because my husband teaches here. So my choices, we wanted to live together. We had spent our entire graduate school career apart for 4 years. I was at Columbia and he was in Germany. And so we decided I took the UMass job. And I wrote a little bit about it in this op-ed I wrote for the New York Times on
Mhm.
why Kamala Harris matters to me. I talked about my experience and how I chose to join an Afro-American Studies department, even though I had an affiliation in the history department. My home department was AFAM at UMass. And of course, I was there for over 20 years before I moved to UConn in 2016. So it was interesting. And still today, there'll be times where people are more dismissive of you until you actually speak to them, right? And I've always done what my father advised me because, of course, he joined the British Indian Army, and he was the only Indian officer. And that during the Second World War, they liberalized Indians joining the officer ranks because earlier on was really the Brits were the officers and the Indians were soldiers. So, as an officer in the British Indian Army, the kind of overt racism that sometimes he faced from the British officers was quite something. And he confronted it with such grace and humor. And so I kind of learned a little bit from all his stories about serving in the British Indian Army before independence, where sometimes the only meal choice would be, for instance, beef, and they knew that he was a Hindu, that he wouldn't eat it. So, he would go and eat with the Indian soldiers because he would not, because he was hungry. He hadn't eaten the main course in the club. And he was called up sometimes, and they would tell him. So he really navigated that in his own way really well. And I think I've managed to do that, and to a certain extent established myself in my profession, where people talk about my unusual background, but it's not the main thing. And I think part of it has to do with people like Barack Obama and Kamala Harris, right? I think if you remember the election, they purposely mispronounced her name
Kamala.
consistently. Kamala, and they would like make fun of her name
Right.
purposely, right? And I would correct people who called me Manisha, and I would say, no, it's Manisha. It's like a double E, or. And after Barack Obama became president, I'm like, I don't have to apologize for my name anymore. So there were barriers. And in 2024, I was the first Indian American president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And as a woman doing political history, and I was hoping Kamala would also be the first Indian American. I wrote a piece for the American Kahani, thanks to you, Rohit. I was trying to write a piece to tell Indian Americans to
Right.
vote for her because there were some Indian Americans who were so conservative on certain
Mhm.
issues that they were not willing to vote for her. But I found her story and her mother's story so inspiring,
Very compelling.
very compelling. And so I wrote that piece. I wanted it to reach Indian Americans. And thanks to you, Rohit, I was able to place it in an
Okay.
Indian American Outlook, American Kahani, which is, I think, a
Mhm.
good online magazine for Indian Americans. And it's pretty good in how balanced it is.
And
So
actually,
I
just to follow
definitely
up on that, in terms of silencing, you talk about being a woman in what's a male-dominated field. I certainly have learned over time not to talk over women, and I realized I did that probably 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm very conscious of that. Um, have you had male colleagues maybe steal your ideas, or male colleagues talk over you at conferences, act like they know more? And if so, how have you handled that? How
yeah.
diplomatically have you handled that? How much have you confronted? I know you used the example of your father and how he confronted British soldiers.
That's a great question, Rohit, because my very first conference at the Southern Historical Association meeting, I was in a huge round table and had freshly emerged from grad school, just defended my dissertation. And there were all these old white Southern men, but they were all political historians, and then there was me. And I was literally being told by them that stick to your lane, which is social history and slavery. Why are you doing political history? But my first book was all on states' rights theory and pro-slavery ideology. So I was like meeting them on their turf. And I remember Barbara Fields, who was the second reader for my dissertation, came and sat right up in front so that she could like support me. And, maybe it was growing up in India, and maybe it was having a father who never told us that just because you're girls, your only destiny is to get married. My father was pretty conservative and traditional in certain ways, but he would say things like, I got a master's in history. I want all my three daughters to get PhDs in history. So he was really an encouraging force in our life. And when we all chose to marry, one a Spaniard, one an American, I'm married to a German, my mother calls it a mini United Nations. He never made us feel bad about that, right? He never said, you're marrying out, you must marry only, and we have an arranged marriage, because none of us wanted arranged marriages, which in India was the common thing when I grew up. And so maybe it was that, maybe it was going to an all-girls school and all-girls colleges that I never learned to defer to men. I would argue with men. And I remember my first grad seminar at Columbia, there were a few of us women. It was an Eric seminar, and it was mainly guys. And the women were very deferential to the men. And I wasn't, I was like this loudmouth Indian woman who just like spoke her mind. And maybe it was that I did not let it intimidate me. But you're right, a lot of times, especially when I was at UMass, I was writing my book on abolition for 10, 20 years, and I would see ideas that I presented at conferences or, wrote an article on, which was ignored, and then people taking those ideas and passing it off as their own. And I remember complaining about it to my sister, who's also a historian, but more of British India and empire and gender. And she told me, she said, you know what? Don't pay attention to it, because in the end, no one's going to write the book that you're going to write. Even if they steal your ideas, they haven't got your full, they haven't done the full
Depth.
research
Yeah.
you have. So don't worry. And it is true. Many people wrote different parts of my book because it's such a big book from the Revolution to the Civil War. Even younger scholars who take one little part of what I was writing about and then write a whole book on it. And when eventually published my book, I was done with it in 2013, it was published in 2016. I made sure that I footnoted all those young scholars who had written those parts or others,
Mhm.
because I was like, you know what? This is a combined, a collective thing. And in the end, what my sister said was right, because the book won so many prizes and it, did so well. Even my naysayers who kept saying, oh, this is mainly a synthetic book. Well, no, it's based on a lot of research, primary research. You know, they they had to just acknowledge that, in the end, the work speaks for itself, but you just have to deal with it. And it's this extra burden that I think all women professionals carry with them, and the suspicion that, oh, you've gotten there only because you're non-white or you're a woman, because it's DEI. It's not your work. And my response to that is just to work harder and publish more, which I think pisses them off even more. So that's the way I deal with it. But it can be frustrating, and it can be depressing at times, because you feel you've accomplished a lot and you shouldn't have to deal with all these petty things. But, I guess we are all human beings and you
So
deal
I'll hand it off to Sachi to take us to the finish line in a moment. But I just wanted to add that when you were talking about sort of people picking off pieces, that Whitman wrote in Leaves of Grass, which was published, I think, during the Reconstruction period. I am large, I contain multitudes. And I think you're such a giant in intellectual history and certainly the history of abolition,
just a
Reconstruction.
nerd historian.
What's that?
I'm just a nerd historian.
Well, you can say that, but you're such a giant that people can pick off pieces, but you see the whole picture, and your book, really gives a global, it creates there's a global idea which you're putting forth, and you have the scholarship to justify it, and that's really quite amazing. So, and it's been an honor to listen to you and learn from you today. So, just wanted to say that.
I want to echo Rohit, and you've given us advice about not only the scholarship, but also what it means to be a young scholar that might be looking for how to engage and how to go against the grain, or maybe look at a paradigm shift differently and have the courage to argue with people and not always follow what other people say. And I think that is so impressive, and it takes a lot of courage. And so I'm just amazed and inspired by you, and you set a great example for young women who want to go into scholarship, into research. So I'm very inspired. And just to end off, we always end our episodes with some actionable items for our audience. So you've given us a lot of advice, but what are some ways that our audiences can start revisiting, learning, and engaging more with history, and just becoming, as you mentioned before, as an American citizen, we need to study history and we need to be well informed and see how patterns exist from the past into the present, which your work is beautifully tying together and reinforcing. But if you have any, takeaways or tips for our audience to better engage with history.
Yeah, so that's really important, I think, for the broader public to read history. If you can, pick up the latest history books, if you're interested in reading nonfiction, but also visit our museums, go to national park sites. They've done a wonderful job in the last few decades with professionally trained historians and public historians in these sites, and they are much more vulnerable and under attack today by the Trump regime. Their funding is being cut. What they are saying is being politicized. They can't say what they want to say, but they're all excellent people doing a lot of really good work for not much money. So support your museums, support your state historical societies, go to national park sites, read history books. And you'll find that, the real history is actually far more interesting than sanitized versions of the past. Like my students, especially my undergrads, who I take as being like the general public, because not all of them are history majors. Some of them are taking my course to satisfy a requirement, especially your medical school type, Sachi, are really, they're like, we must get an A because I'm applying to medical school. I'm like, that's fine, but just do the work and then, you will get the rewards. Don't be so obsessed about getting that A. But in any case, I see my undergraduate students a little bit like that, as the broader public. And that has helped me to do like public lectures because you need to meet people where they are. You can't just like constantly preach at them. You need to get them interested. And if you're really passionate about the work you're doing, you convey it. Like people will remember going to a museum where the docent was great. They will remember going to a national park site if they're open. Now they've had such severe funding cuts. If the National Park Service officer there is really into it and has studied it and conveys that information. So I would say there are many ways to support history. Your local public library. I do a lot of talks at public libraries. I've done talks at public libraries all over the country. And you see that there is a public out there that's really hungering for that information and that is ready. So that's my actionable items for you. Go support your local institutions, the libraries, the museums, the historical societies, even the national park sites. Sometimes there are these little gems hidden. Like I'll go to some place in the middle of nowhere and they will have like a little house, a local abolitionist or a local suffragist, and they have her story, and it's actually really quite interesting. So yeah, when I retire, I'm going to, my sons always tell me, why don't you write fiction? More people will read you than if you write history. But certainly, I think it's important for us to support, the field in the broadest way possible. Because a lot of historians today are not getting those tenure track jobs because of the lack of funding. Now the sciences are feeling what we have felt for decades, which is suddenly federal grants are just like upended and taken away from research. But support those people. They're vulnerable. They're not paid well, and they do things because they love doing it and because they love of history. So that would be my actionable item.
So it seems like it's really important these days to really read history because what's being erased, you want to make sure what is being erased and understand why, because they're trying to transmit negative ideas. and you have to make sure you understand the facts, so that their ideas are not able to take hold. So,
Absolutely. I mean, the people who burn history books, there's a long list of them, have never been the good people. The people who ban history books have never been the good people.
right.
So I
Yeah.
think that is that tradition. And, yeah, absolutely. That's what we should be doing.
Wonderful. I think that I've learned so much in this episode, and we are just so grateful for your time, Dr. Sinha. This has been so informative, and I know our audience is going to have a lot of resources. We'll link in the description to your books, to your writing, to museums and exhibits that could be nearby in the area that people can visit. And I just want to thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Sachi and Rohit.